This man was about to go surfing in the sea when he unexpectedly slipped down the hillside with one foot in the air. He was instantly terrified, frantically grabbing at the ground with both hands, because behind him was a 100-meter high cliff, and if he fell, it would surely mean death. He desperately clung to the sand, almost grinding his palms raw before he finally stopped sliding. However, just as the man managed to stabilize himself, the soft sand couldn't bear his weight. Before long, he started sliding down again. The man desperately waved his hands, trying to grab onto something, but the bare cliff face was as smooth as his bald head. The man got a moment's respite, when suddenly the phone in his backpack started ringing. He was momentarily stunned. Now, with his life hanging by a thread, he didn't even dare to breathe, let alone answer the call, but the phone kept ringing incessantly, like a lifeline. After much hesitation, the man finally decided to answer the call, thinking it might be his chance for rescue. But just as he was about to reach for his phone, his other hand slipped, and he lost control, sliding down again. Luckily, he managed to grab the edge of the cliff once more, narrowly avoiding a direct fall. This time, the man didn't dare to move an inch. He knew that even the slightest mistake would result in him being crushed to pieces. But the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below kept pounding at his nerves with each crash. He knew his strength wouldn't last much longer, so he decided to make one last desperate attempt. He calculated the timing of the waves hitting the cliff face over and over, and just as the next wave was about to hit, the man suddenly opened his eyes wide and jumped from the 100-meter high cliff. Although the waves cushioned his fall somewhat, he didn't die on impact, but his thigh still slammed hard against the rocks. Despite this, the desperate man felt he wasn't seriously injured. He swam to the surface with all his might, then crawled onto a rock, gasping for air and panting heavily. But just as he stood up, ready to leave this place, he heard a loud crack from his thigh, and then he passed out. When the man regained consciousness, he discovered that not only his waist, but his entire body had suffered severe injuries. And the lower half of his body was no longer able to move. He hurriedly took off his backpack, wanting to take out the mobile phone inside to call for help, but he found that the phone had been submerged and wouldn't turn on. He began to shout loudly for help, but this place was deserted and no one responded to his calls. Finally, the man had no choice but to give up. He took off his t-shirt and crudely bandaged the wound on his hand. Then he looked around once more. He noticed the land on the other side of the strait. If he could swim across, he might have a chance at survival. So he crawled into the sea, paddling hard with his uninjured arm. But he hadn't gone far before he exhausted his strength and began to sink. The man helplessly tried to call for help, but only a stream of bubbles came out of his mouth. Just as he was about to drown, he realized that only he could save himself. So the man frantically paddled upwards, finally managing to surface before drowning. However, when he came to, he found himself washed up at the base of a cliff. He leaned tiredly against the rocks. It was then that he spotted his surfboard washed up on the beach, so he crawled over trying to retrieve the board, but the next second, he was mercilessly slammed against the reef by a wave, knocking him unconscious again. The waves then swept him back into deeper water. Luckily, he regained consciousness in time, but severely injured, he couldn't withstand the turbulent waves. He was about to be dragged into the deep sea again. At the critical moment, he desperately flung his backpack, managing to hook one strap onto the reef. Then he hooked his arm through another strap, securing his body firmly. But just at that moment, a helicopter flew overhead. The man shouted for help, but his voice was drowned out by the waves. He could only watch helplessly as the helicopter flew away. Who knows how long it took for the tide to finally recede? But by then, the man was completely exhausted, hanging onto the reef, barely breathing. Unexpectedly, a hungry seagull pecked a piece of flesh from his hand. The man was instantly jolted awake. He quickly shooed away the seagull, then struggled to tear off the backpack straps, falling heavily onto the beach. He then crawled along the sand with great difficulty, desperate to find some water to drink. But after just a few movements, his arm was pierced by a fishhook, buried in the sand. He painfully pulled out the fishhook, then lay down on the beach, unable to understand why fate was torturing him like this. Soon night fell. Thunder rumbled in the sky. The man took out a cup he'd found, hoping to catch some rainwater to drink, but the weather was unpredictable. With thunder and only a few drops of rain, he only managed to collect a drop or two. Somehow, he made it through to the next day. The man was unbearably hungry, so he leaned against a rock wall, pretending to be dead, trying to ambush a seagull that might come close. He quietly opened his eyes and found a seagull had already approached. He gripped his stick tightly, then swung it at the bird, but the seagull flew away just in time. Just as the man was losing hope, he spotted a surfboard not far away. He quickly crawled over to it, as if grasping at a lifeline, but soon he pushed the surfboard aside. Despite being an expert surfer, his legs were now paralyzed and useless. How could he swim to the opposite shore? He lay helplessly on the beach, gazing at the endless waves, desperately wishing for someone to rescue him, but fate wasn't going to make it easy for him. Soon the tide began to rise again. The SOS sign he had painstakingly written in the sand was washed away by the waves. His hope for survival was crushed once more. Even seagulls gathered nearby, as if waiting for his demise. Looking at the crashing waves, the man refused to just wait for death, so he dragged the surfboard, like a fish refusing to be beached, struggling to paddle into the surging sea, but the waves grew higher and higher, repeatedly pushing him back to shore. Yet even then, the man didn't give up easily. Like a tireless machine, he swam forward again and again, without the slightest hesitation. Finally, the tide relented, and the man at last reached calmer waters. But after swimming for who knows how long, he had exhausted all his strength. Lying motionless on the surfboard, though he couldn't move a muscle, his heart was no longer panicked. Instead, he felt an unprecedented calm. He was no longer afraid of death. Soon, the man closed his eyes. He let go of the surfboard, allowing himself to slowly sink into the sea. But just as he was about to drown, a miracle occurred. A small boat appeared on the surface. A diver swam to his side and brought him up to safety. The man was finally rescued. This film is based on a true story. At the end of the movie, the man returns to the beach where it all happened, and the man beside him is the real-life inspiration for the character. He uses his personal experience to tell us that while the sea is beautiful, beneath its stunning surface often lie many hidden dangers, and to always be cautious when venturing out.